welcome back. In this video, we are going to take a look at organic functional groups and their class names. And this is a really important part of understanding organic chemistry. And unfortunately, these are things that you are going to have to memorize. You do want to know the functional groups as well as the classes. And the difference between those two things is that this is known as the reactivity site. And the class is just the type of compound in general. So the functional group is where the reactivity site is. That's where the chemical reactions take place in general. And the class is just the type of the compound. And there's quite a few. And again, you do want to commit these to your memory. It will take some time and some practice, but once you have them memorized, your life in organic chemistry will be a lot easier. So let's start from the beginning. We'll have our class, our functional groups, the name of functional group, because sometimes that can be a little bit different, and then the suffix, which we will use in naming, and I'll do another video about that a little bit later on. So the first class that we can discuss are the alkanes, and alkanes actually do not have any functional group. They only have single bonds, which of course would in this case only contain carbon and hydrogen because there's actually no functional group. There's no name of a functional group because there's no functional group. And the suffix that we'll use in naming is ane, A-N-E. So some examples that you may have heard before are methane, ethane, butane, propane. The next class, the alkenes. So we have alkanes and alkenes. The alkene functional group is actually a double bond, a carbon-carbon double bond. Carbon-carbon double bond. And of course, there would be groups coming off of each of those carbons. The name of the functional group is alkenyl, and the suffix that we would use in naming is ene, E-N-E. So you may have heard of propene, ethene, methane, butene. All of those would have the double carbon bond. Next on our list, we have the alkynes. So alkane is a single bond, alkene is a double bond. If you're thinking maybe the alkynes are a triple bond, you would be correct. Alkynes have a carbon-carbon triple bond. And the functional group name is alkenyl. Alkenyl. And the only thing that's different between the alkenes and the alkynes in the functional group name is there's an E here and a Y here. So it does get a little bit confusing, and the ending is Y-N-E or ine. So you may have heard of methine, ethine, butine. And there are some different ways of pronouncing this depending on where you study or where you come from. I studied in the United States, so I have heard methine, butine, ethine, but I'm currently teaching in Europe, and a lot of teachers here will still say ethene, butene. But to me, that's a little bit confusing because we have E-N-E here, and the way you pronounce that is definitely ethene, methane, butene. So I like to distinguish between the two using the ine sound, and also that's what I heard going to university as well. So if your teacher uses ine here, that's fine, but I would recommend using ine as that pronunciation, just to help you distinguish between the alkenes and the alkynes. Next, we have alcohols. These are very easy to identify. Alcohols will always have an OH group somewhere on the molecule or on the compound. The name of the OH group is hydroxyl, and the suffix is anal. So butanol, propanol, methanol, ethanol. You've probably heard of a few of those before. Next on our list, we have ethers. Ether has an oxygen in between two different groups. We denote groups using the letter R. That's just common convention in organic chemistry. So these could be carbons, or they could be any other group really. R is just an arbitrary letter that we use for different groups in organic chemistry. The functional name is actually also ether, which is nice. And the suffix, this is a weird one. The suffix is oxyalkane. So this part of the suffix is dependent on how many carbons you have in your chain. And I will cover that more when I put up a video about how to name organic compounds. But for example, you could have oxyethane or oxymethane or oxypropane. So it depends on how many carbons are in your chain. Next on our list, we have the aldehydes. And the functional group is a carbon-oxygen double bond and a hydrogen. And notice, so we have one bond here. This means that this carbon will either be on the end of a chain or sticking off of a carbon somewhere in the middle. The functional group's name is aldehyde. Again, it matches, which is nice. And the suffix that we use here is enal, so propanal, ethanal, methanal, butanal. Next, we have ketones. Ketones have a carbon with a double bonded oxygen, but it's in the middle of your molecule or compound somewhere. So you do have two groups coming off of that carbon. The functional group is carbonyl. That's what the name of the functional group is. And the suffix is enone. So propanone, butanone, methanone. Carboxylic acid is next on our list. And carboxylic acid looks very similar to an aldehyde. So we have our carbon with our double bonded oxygen, but then we actually have an OH group. So it's kind of like an aldehyde and an alcohol mixed together. We have our double bonded carbon, an oxygen, and our hydrogen. And just for reference, here's the aldehyde again. Notice we've just added an oxygen here off of the carbon, and then our hydrogen is on the oxygen. So double bonded oxygen and then a hydroxyl group. The name of this functional group is carboxyl. And notice it's similar to the name hydroxyl because we do have that alcohol group. So carboxyl. And the suffix is enoic acid. So propanoic acid, methanoic acid, ethanoic acid would be some examples. Next, let's look at an ester. Esters are also similar actually to carboxylic acids. We have that double bonded carbon oxygen and we have an oxygen as well. But instead of a hydrogen, we actually have another R group. So this functional group would be sitting in the middle of a compound. Carboxylic acid is at the edge or coming off of a carbon atom, but this ester, there's a group here somewhere and there's an R group here. So this is in the middle of a compound. And notice the only thing that's different between these two, besides the fact that an ester has to be in the middle of a compound, is that we don't have that hydroxyl group on an ester. The functional group name is also ester, and the suffix that we use here is enoate. But because it's in the middle of a compound, we actually break this name into two different sections. So you would have the first part of your compound here would have a name, and then the second part of your compound would contain this suffix. So the second part of your compound could be named propanoate or methanoate or butanoate. And I will put up some examples of how to name, and especially with esters, because esters can get a little bit confusing as far as naming goes. Next, we have amides. Amides are fairly easy to identify because they have an NH2 group. So we have a carbon-oxygen double bond again, But then we have a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. And the functional group name here is carboxyamide, because notice we still have this carbon-oxygen double bond, so carboxy. And the amide comes from this part of the functional group here. And the suffix that we use when we're naming is animide. And you may have heard of propanamide or methanamide or butanamide. And next on our list we have nitrile. Nitrile. Nitrile is a carbon-nitrogen triple bond. Carbon-nitrogen triple bond. And the functional group here is nitrile. And the suffix that we use when we're naming is anenitrile. So you may have heard of propanenitrile or ethanenitrile. And last but not least, another popular class of molecules are the arenes. Arenes are made out of a ring of carbon double bonds, alternating double bonds, and there's usually a functional group coming off of that. The functional group name of the ring itself is phenyl. And the suffix that we use is benzene. So I'm sure you've heard of benzene rings. You may have heard of methylbenzene or ethylbenzene. And those are all of our major classes of organic compounds, along with their functional group names. And again, I know there's quite a few of them, but once you learn how to identify them, it will make your life so much easier in organic chemistry, and it will also make naming easier. It will make drawing out your mechanisms easier. Overall, it will just make your life easier. So I would say that you need to take the time to really study and commit these to memory. Thank you so much for stopping by. I will make sure that I put up some more organic videos. I know that's a big topic, especially in IB. Thank you so much for stopping by.